Everybody. Welcome to our event on artificial intelligence. Welcome to those of you who are joining us at the Laurier Center for the Study of Canada, and welcome to those of you who are joining us on Zoom. Before we get into the substance of the matter today, I want to make a couple little announcements or comments. First, I want to note that 2025 marks the 100th anniversary of the Faculty of Arts at Laurier, as you'll see on the banner over there. And we are celebrating throughout the whole year. We're celebrating the exceptional student experience, we're celebrating the research impact that our arts colleagues have, and we're celebrating the accomplishments of our fabulous alumni. And today's event marks an opportunity to celebrate all of those things. If you're interested in knowing more about our 100 years activities, I would encourage you to Google Laurier Arts 100, and that will bring you to our centenary website, and or follow us on our Faculty of Arts LinkedIn. Before we get into the subject of AI today, I just want to note that the Laurier Center for the Study of Canada is located on the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and Neutral Peoples. I think through our research and teaching mission at the center, we work to advance reconciliation. This includes, but it is not limited to, I think, a genuine effort to respond to the truth and reconciliation calls for action that are directed at universities. Today, I want to acknowledge the historical and continuing stewardship of these lands by the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. I want to acknowledge what was taken from Indigenous peoples in this region and our shared responsibility to heal that legacy. Now we'll turn to one of the topics that I think is the hottest of the moment, and that is artificial intelligence. And we're so lucky to have three people here to help us understand what the issues are around artificial intelligence. Mark Humphries is a professor of history at Laurier. He has published numerous books and articles on Canadian history, public health, the First World War. He has also been thinking deeply about AI in the last few years, specifically the application of large language models, partly as a tool in his own research, but more broadly as a phenomenon that researchers and others need to confront. And Mark also is a double alumnus of Laurier. He has a Bachelor of Arts in History and a Master of Arts in History from the department where he now teaches. And Mark, for those of you who are interested in this, publishes a free Substack called Generative History, generativhistory.substack.com, where some of his thoughts on a lot of these issues can be followed. Jason Shim is the Chief Digital Officer for the Canadian Centre for Nonprofit Digital Resilience. I want to get that right. In this role, he drives initiatives that empower nonprofits across Canada to use data and technology to amplify their missions and for the social good. I think he's really been a visionary leader in digital strategy, dedicated to leveraging technology for the social good. Jason also serves as an editor for Ledger, an academic journal focused on blockchain research. So in addition to AI, he knows a little bit about crypto, I'm guessing. And Jason is a proud Laurier alumnus from the Religion and Culture program. Last but not least, Byron Williston is a professor of philosophy at Laurier. He has published widely on the history of modern philosophy, ethics, Heidegger's philosophy of technology, which sounds super interesting, among many other topics. He is the author or editor of several books on the climate crisis, including The Ethics of Climate Change, Environmental Ethics for Canadians, and Philosophy and the Climate Crisis. But his current work is on various aspects of the philosophy of digital technology. So we're super fortunate to have the three of you here today to help us think this through. And I think the format for today is that I'm going to start us off with some questions to our panelists, and we'll have a little bit of a chat, and then we'll open that chat up to those of you who are in the room and those of you who are on Zoom. Okay. Mark, maybe I'll start with you. If I'm being honest, I would admit, I think, that when we start to talk about AI, I'm not actually 100% sure what we're talking about. I'm hearing a lot of terms, generative AI, artificial general intelligence, high impact AI. I don't know what they all are. I have kind of a general sense that Some of these technologies are transformative and are probably going to help in important ways, medical diagnoses. I have a low-grade dread that some of these technologies are going to make me redundant. So I don't know. I'm hearing it and I don't know. So could you, I mean, I suspect I'm not alone. So I wonder, could you start us off with maybe a tour of the landscape? What are we talking about when we're talking about AI? And what do we need to know as citizens who are in a society where AI is ostensibly accelerating in really significant ways? What do we need to know?
All right, thanks, Patty. Thanks for having me as well here. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a good question because I think one of the problems that we face is there's a lot of information out there. It's very hard, I think, for most people to know what to trust and what not to trust. And I think, unlike a lot of technologies that we're used to dealing with, it's evolving so quickly that it's also very hard to stay on top of everything. So I spend a lot of time myself, on AI Twitter and stuff like that, just keeping abreast of what's happening. And that's a very hard thing to do, even if you're in the middle of it. So that, I think, creates a really big problem for people to kind of, what's your entry point? I think, generally speaking, at kind of a first kind of way of thinking about this, right, would be that there's different types of AI. So there's traditional AI research, which is very different from where maybe we are now with generative AI. And so AI research, starts back in the 1940s. It goes all the way through up until the present. Takes a very different path in some ways than where generative AI comes out of. And generative AI is about using deep learning. Large language models are based in deep learning and the creation of neural networks that effectively act as computers, where you put an input in one side of it, inside a black box, the network does something to that input, and then you get an output out the other side. And it's really hard to look inside and see what's actually happening inside of the large language models. What makes them different is that they kind of do this thinking process through that process of running information through the neural network. And although they're trained initially, the way you create the network is to teach them how to predict kind of the next word, kind of like autocomplete on your phone. One of the problems that we run into is that they obviously do much more than that. And so you can kind of intuitively know this. If you use ChatGPT, you can, ask it a question. It can understand what you're saying. You can figure that out. There's a level of understanding that's just obvious, right, to at least most of the things we engage with. And then the other problem we run into is, at the same time, how reliable are those outputs, right? What exactly is going on? Because you can't look inside the black box. It's very hard to know. And so I think, to understand for people at the outset is that this is evolving very quickly. And most of the people who are working in the field are also evolving their knowledge. So a lot of the things that large language models turn out to be able to do are not things necessarily that the people who created them anticipated in the first place. And I think this is one of the things that makes the technology so potentially disruptive, right? Is that what we might see happen with this is that as these models continue to get better, we're going to see them be able to do more things, which has been fairly consistent over the last few years. And as you're able to offload more tasks to these models, they're able to do things for longer periods of time. They become agentic, which is kind of the new word that's out there now, but it basically means, you hit a button, you sit back, get a coffee, and you let the computer do something for you. As these things get integrated into the tools we use, so into the actual program, so that you don't even know you're using a large language model, that's where the disruption really comes in. It's not so much, I guess the last thing I'd say about, this, the opening question is, like, I think it's really unfortunate that a lot of people come to AI, first of all, from using ChatGPT, because it's a really misleading interface in a lot of ways, in the sense that, yes, these models can chat, yes, it's conversational, but in a lot of ways, the really transformative stuff is going to happen when they become agents and do things for us, and we don't actually have conversations anymore. You actually rely on them to do things. You asked about AGI as well, and ASI, and we talked about that a little bit before in a pre-meeting a while ago. And one of the things that I think is important to understand too is that there's this sense in the AI community that we are moving towards this point when you're going to have machines that are effectively going to be as good as humans on any task that a human can use to do on a computer, right? And people call this AGI. Whether that's a useful term or not, I think is a very different kind of question. We can talk about that. But there's this kind of sense that we're moving towards that relatively quickly. And whether or not that's true, I think is different from the fact that there's an awful lot of people and money invested in the idea that it's going to be true. And even if we don't achieve something that looks like that in the next 2 to 3 years, which is kind of what a lot of AI labs think, I think it's safe to say that what we've seen so far is going to be enough to kind of occupy our time in figuring out how to use it and work with it over, the next decade.
So are large language models and AI synonymous? Is a large language model one example of AI? Is it the most common example?
It's a type of artificial intelligence, right? So early versions of artificial intelligence, much more often focused on symbolic AI. So this is, programming a computer to do things through if-then statements and teaching them information about the world and kind of filling in as much information into a system so that it can do specific tasks. Generative AI is different in the sense that the idea here is instead of training the computer specifically across, a few given tasks or to do specific operations, you create a general kind of purpose system which can do all kinds of things, and that you don't actually have to train that system yourself, which is really time intensive. You can actually offload that training to the model itself, and it can teach itself. That's where a lot of the energy consumption and the power use comes in, because again, it's really energy consumptive, but not necessarily time consumptive. And so the idea is efficiency, that you can create a model that's able to do a lot of different stuff, be like the Swiss Army knife effectively of computers, rather than creating individual programs that effectively can only do one thing without having to change the program. That's why the generative AI has really taken off, because you can use it to do anything from generate text to images to video to sound to the reverse of all of that, right? And that's kind of the purpose behind it.
And just last question to you for now, but I find this really helpful. It is the creation of a large language model or an AI model something that will become relatively accessible to many, or is it the use of them? Is it the expectation that we will be creating these things, or that we will be using them, or both?
I think most people, my guess would be it would be in the use side of things, not in the creating side of things. It's as one of the things that we have to understand is that there's a scaling kind of phenomenon where the larger the model gets, the more things the model can do. And there's a debate about whether or not this is going to stop in the near future, or whether it's going to continue going for a long time. But effectively, to get the models to do the things that will make them most economically useful, they have to be really, really big and cost millions, hundreds of millions of dollars to train these models, right? That said, people are creating smaller versions, and it's entirely possible, I think, that in the not too distant future, you'll have much more specialized, smaller models that might be an historian model, a political scientist model, something like that, discipline-specific models. And there's a lot of people building these now. Most people, though, are going to be on the use side, not on the training side.
Okay, thank you. So Jason, for you, so you're working in the nonprofit sector. You're out there in the world. And it seems to me you have at least two ways that you probably encounter AI. A, you can use it as a tool in your work if you choose, or B, you are training people. You are a bit of an interpreter for people on AI, helping them understand where the applications might be for them, or whether it's something they want to adopt. I mean, what have you observed so far in terms of impact? On some level, it sounds like we're early days, but it also seems like things are moving quickly. I mean, what have you noticed about impact in your world?
Yeah. So I think that when talking about AI in general, that there's a certain, still a pervasive discomfort that I sense in presentations. And I'll give you an example, is that I was recently delivering a presentation, and I asked to the audience, mostly the folks who are working in nonprofit, like how many of you are using AI in some way, shape, or form that may pertain to your work? And a whole bunch of hands go up. And then I posed the question, and how many of your workplaces have an official policy or are aware that you're using AI? And then a whole bunch of hands go down. And I think that gap between the hands that were up and the hands that went down is the space that I'm seeking to address in making people more comfortable in first like talking about it out loud, where I think there's this navigation of oh, if I use AI, like, is it permissible? And I think that a lot of the things pertaining to the usage and governance of AI within organizations is these aren't necessarily AI conversations. Like, these are governance conversations. These are policy conversations. And one of the spaces or one of the requests I've been getting quite often is, is there an AI policy that I can refer to, or is there something that I can look to provide better guidance for individuals? But I think it goes beyond that as well, that as nonprofits and organizations are thinking about how they use AI, it speaks to the broader considerations of organizational values and personal values. And I think it underscores the importance of organizations to have that crystal clear for themselves. Like, not only like, hey, what do we stand for? How do we, like, not just what do we stand for, but how do we do the work? And how does that translate into conveying that to everyone who works with this organization? So it goes down to even like performance review type considerations where, as you're reviewing, an employee's performance, are you also evaluating, are they living out the organizational values, and what does that translate into? So, when considering things like AI, if there is use of it, also, if you are using AI, how is it also aligned to our stated values and how we go out and set out to do good in the world? I think there definitely is a steep learning curve to AI. I mean, in terms of dipping your toe in the water initially, like, the chat interface makes it deceptively simple. But a common inquiry that I get is, oh, the AI can't do this or that, and there's an entire series of like I would say almost like incantations of like prompt engineering to get like more specific responses that are very particular to what people are seeking out. But also the upskilling that is required. Speaking about solely about AI itself, it's understanding first, are people clear about the job that they have to do? And that seems like a simple statement, but for many organizations, there may or may not be standard operating procedures that are like clearly outlined, or a defined workflow. And if those workflows aren't clearly defined, like, feeding into AI is just going to get you lost faster and increase the confusion. And also it's things, again, that are not necessarily directly tied to AI, but things like making sure all your documents are in order, that are minutes taken after every meeting and clearly filed and everything, so that if you were to direct an AI towards it, it could find everything it needed. So just general staying organized within an organization is also very important. But I think because AI is also changing so quickly, it requires an approach of constant learning. And so that's something that I really have to underscore with folks as they are considering and taking on considerations of AI, that the AI that you're learning about like last year, a new feature comes out, a new model comes out that you have to like relearn, how to use it effectively as it applies to your job role. And I find that that's, while it's the great kind of, you have to stay on top of it all the time, it's also the great leveler that, when a new model like drops, as of last week, that resets me to back to a baseline as well, that, I'm with everyone else also like trying to learn as quickly as possible. So I think the emphasis for organization is, making sure that, they are agile and learning how to learn very quickly.
That's very interesting, and it seems to add another layer of complication, because I want to get back to this values question here with all of you. But it seems to me that it's very difficult to identify your values and figure out how they land if you don't understand the applications that are being mobilized in your organization. Have you found any shortcuts or any ways when you're dealing with your clients to say, if you want to get up to speed quickly on AI, you probably want to do these 3 things? Are there shortcuts like that? And whose responsibility is it to ensure that people are understanding the applications such that they are using them in ways that are meaningful and reflect their values?
Mm-hmm. So when it comes to the shortcuts, I often suggest to folks, like, if they haven't touched AI at all, like, to, dip your toe in the water and, have a quick, conversation just to get a sense of, like, the basics of it. And, there's tons of resources online as well, with regards to, how to do, basic prompting, for, current kind of AI models. But I also ask people to sit down and think about, a certain things like, can you identify something that you're doing, 5 times in the exact same way on a computer? And that's usually an indicator that's like, yeah, that can probably be automated, or, AI can do that. Another question I like to explore with folks is just posing the question, and it's inspired by the Arthur C. Clarke quotation that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And that if you could wave the magic wand, what would be true about your work, for your organization? And while the technology may not exist to do that thing today, it might in, another month, 6 months, a year, 3 years, but at least you have a list of those things. And so, let's take, for example, expense claim reports that, if I could wave the magic wand, an expense claim report would fill itself out. That I actually would identify that quite regularly in presentations, I was given like 5 years ago, and, everyone would get a chuckle. It's like, expense claim, form that could fill out itself. It's like, well, now you can, like, you literally can just, upload stuff, upload a template, and then, it'll come out the other end, and you'll save yourself a ton of time. Or, working with a public data set that's like, tens of thousands of rows that you need to classify, that ordinarily you'd have to go through it manually, that, we're at a level where AI is uh, accurate enough to, classify, mass amounts of data that otherwise would have taken like 10 to 12 hours with sufficient accuracy. So in terms of shortcuts to get started, I don't want to simplify it to like purely this, but it's simply to get started. Like, I find that sometimes there's a lot of like consideration, but like, oh, should I, shouldn't I? And it's like, no, the ship has sailed. And in terms of getting started, and whose responsibility it is, I would say that that speaks to how tech is kind of governed, again, in organizations, that in terms of having, like, a dedicated tech budget, but also someone whose role is defined specifically related to technology, digital, AI kind of deployment. It can kind of sit that way as well in terms of like the responsibilities. But I think that over time, the skills of being able to use AI will be akin to, the just the assumption that these days most people, when they're, working in a job, that they know how to use like a word processing software as well. So over time, I think that will become more distributed in terms of, that it will become table stakes.
Interesting. So, Byron, let me turn to you. You are, among many things, a philosopher.
Not much else, actually.
That's enough. Jason raises this question of values. I'm guessing that from a philosophical standpoint, you're also an ethicist. I don't know if the two are synonymous, or if the ethics piece brings in another perspective to this conversation. But it seems to me that we really marvel at the speed of the advancements and the technology. And oh my goodness, look what we're able to do. I don't see as many conversations about ethics. And how should we be thinking about the ethics of this? And maybe there are more conversations out there that I haven't seen. I mean, what's your sense of the ethical lens on the developments of AI as they've sort of emerged so far?
Yeah, so it's a good question. I mean, ethics is a branch of philosophy. There are 5 or 6 sort of large branches of philosophy. Ethics is one of them, and there's some sub branches on ethics itself, right? One of which is applied ethics. So that's ethics as applied to the business world, medicine, climate change, environment more generally, and of course technology as well. So it's so that's how it kind of fits in terms of a taxonomy, right? The taxonomy of the discipline. What we're trying to do in the philosophy of technology and the ethics of technology is ask about. I mean, ethics is always concerned with ought questions, with should questions. So it's distinct from giving a merely descriptive account of any kind of activity we're engaged in, and is asking questions like, as far as it's possible for us, ought we to be doing those things? Or perhaps something else, right? And so in order to answer questions like that, you got to go to more theoretical levels. Like if you're going to ask ought questions of any of our large-scale societal behaviors, then you need some basis for resolving conflicts of people's views about that, right? So utilitarianism, deontology, natural law theory, social contract theory. There are various ways of working your way through those kinds of issues. With respect to AI in particular, and the values question, I think our thinking as a society and even in philosophy itself is lagging far behind. I don't think we've actually dealt with the ethics of the technologies we're creating in anything like the sophistication or comprehensiveness that's required in order for us to really understand what we're up to. There are a number of ways of trying to articulate that particular worry, right? So you can talk about very particular applications, or you can talk about the more general project itself. Mark mentioned the move toward creating sort of agentic entities, right? I mean, I really think that's something we ought to be talking a lot more about. If we are in the process of creating agents, which I think we are, we got to ask, well, what is an agent, right? And this, it seems to me, is an absolutely, so the title of this panel is the AI revolution, right? This is the most by far revolutionary technology in the history of humanity. And the reason for that is that every single technological invention up until now has been the invention of a tool. I was listening to Mustafa Suleyman, the CEO of Microsoft AI, a couple of days ago, and he said, "We are not making tools. We are engineering persons. We are personality engineers." That's how to describe us. Now, some of this is just sort of like the hype of a CEO of a company, right? Who's trying to sell a product. You gotta take it with that kind of grain of salt. But I think there's a deeper truth in that, right? That we are creating beings, which not now, like I wouldn't want to say that any of these entities are sentient right now, but potentially we are creating novel entities that may themselves have moral status. And we might be creating them in their billions and trillions. And so this, it seems to me, is something we have to take very seriously. Another way to think about that, right, is you can say, oh, well, this is, even if it's possible or true that we're doing that sort of thing, it's 100, 200, 300 years into the future, and so we don't really need to think about it right now. The philosopher Will MacAskill has a great paper out recently called A Century in a Decade. He said the way to think about AI advance, right, is that you're going to get 100 years of what you take to be linear technological development in the course of a decade from now until say 2035, right? So imagine this. Imagine an analog of this. You're in say 1925, right? And between 1925 and 1935, you're going to get all the technological development of what actually happened in the subsequent 100 years, right? That's extraordinary given the amount of technological innovation that we saw in that 100-year period. And so that's why it seems, if he's right about that, and I think he's largely right about it, then that's why we have to think very seriously about the possibility that novel entities that have moral status could emerge onto the scene. This is fundamentally upset our politics and sense of society within a decade. So that's one of the big issues I think we should be talking about more. If we take these developments at all seriously. We can also talk more particularly about the way that AI is being used in warfare in terms of autonomous weaponry, in personal assistance, grief bots and chat bots and love bots, and the whole possibility of massive technological unemployment that could be on the horizon as well. What does that make us think about the meaning and value of work, right? So these are the very kind of large scale issues that I'm kind of working on at the moment.
Is there an analog to this historically? Is there some technology that we've seen coming in the past where we've had to think through the major impact that it has on our day-to-day lives that can help us work through this, or is this unprecedented in some way?
I think it's excuse me, the scale of it. I think MacAskill is right that the speed of it is novel, right? And he doesn't talk about this, right? But I think also what's novel about it is that, as I said before, I simply don't think it's true that with respect to any other technological development, no matter how profound in terms of its societal, political, et cetera, impacts, involve the creation of novel and genuinely ontologically novel entities the way that we're doing right now. So you can nevertheless look for analogs. I mean, I do think the creation of atomic weapons was revolutionary in a different sense, right? Like that made us think that sort of changed geopolitics, among other things, in major ways. The invention of nuclear weapons, right? So you can look to events like that that are technologically inflected in order to get some guidance about possible impacts. But as I said before, I mean, I'm of the belief, I don't know how the others on the panel feel about this, but I'm of the belief that this is not, like, when we use words like disruptive and innovative and so on, that language is way too weak. Right. This is revolutionary technology in the literal meaning of revolution, which is that it's going to upend fundamentally how we think about ourselves, our personal relationships, politics, society, everything. And I don't think there's an analog for that in human history.
Cloning?
Cloning is another example. Yeah.
So let me ask all three of you this then. So I think, Mark and Jason, do you see it in the same way as Byron does, that this is truly transformative in ways that are both positive and negative? But if you do, I guess, what areas of our lives do you see it impacting? And what do we do about it? What is the move that we make this year, in 3 years, in 5 years, to get some guardrails around this, or to start to shape it in a direction that might be palatable to us based on our values or based on our ethics? It's a question for all three of you, but maybe let's come down the row. Mark, why don't you start off, and we'll hear from all of you on those.
I think I broadly agree, with a lot of what Byron said, in the sense that I think technology is certainly probably going to be revolutionary. It may actually be faster than we're talking about as well, right? To me, what I think the most about is work, right? I mean, I think that's where I spend most of my time thinking about how these technologies will affect us. And like what I've seen, for example, in as an historian, what we do as historians is we take documents, we read them, you analyze the documents, you extract information. Those are all tasks that you can get a large language model to do now very accurately. So what I think I've seen in the last 2 years has been remarkable. I actually wrote an article with Eric Story, who's here in the audience today, back about 2 years ago, and some of the things we talked about thinking were 5 or 10 years away at that point happened within a year or a year and a half. You can, now automate large portions of what I do, in the sense that you can very easily get, if you get the tooling right, you can get a large language model to kind of go through 10,000 documents and very quickly pull out all the information you need. Is this document relevant to this topic? Can you find connections between this document and other documents? And you're not so much getting it to do your work for you in terms of the writing, but you can certainly get it to do a lot of that kind of lifting work at the moment in terms of the analysis. And when I think about that, and you think forward where we're going to be in 2 years from that, we are probably at a point where it can do a lot of that type of work. And in terms of agents and things like that, this is what we're describing, right? This is the move towards the idea that you can actually just offload that work automatically. And that's already happening, right? And software and coding is a good example of that. I spend a lot of time programming now, and for the better part of a year now, there have been agentic systems of a sort that have been, at least in theory, capable of automating a lot of coding, and where you simply, it's called vibe coding, where you simply say something in natural language, make a program that does whatever. And in the last few months, those agents as models have gotten better, have gotten really good. And you can now, in a program like Cursor or Devon or something like that, you can very quickly produce a 10,000 line of code program that does exactly what you want it to do in natural language, right? Without really understanding what you're doing. That's going to be hugely disruptive for the software industry. And I think we're going to see that same type of stuff come to information work of all kinds in 2 years. I think the the software industry is kind of at the sharp end of that, and they're about 2 years ahead of everybody else, just because of the nature of what coding's like. You can validate what very easily whether the responses from a model are right or not, whether the code runs. Yeah, and so I think it's going to be hugely disruptive. It's hard for us to envision. It's hard for me to envision what a world looks like where, you know, you might no longer need to have people doing a lot of these tasks. What do we do about that, though? I don't know if there's, I think there's things you can do to a degree, but I think, as Jason was saying, it's here. That's like, even if we stopped all development now, it's already here. And so I don't think you do anything except begin to think about what work is going to look like differently, or how it's going to be different. Yeah.
Okay, Jason?
I would agree with the assessment of it being revolutionary. I think that it would creep up on us almost I would say unexpectedly. And when I say that, it's because when I look at what day-to-day, I look at it from the frame of like, you know, what would day-to-day work look like, and how has it changed even in the past year. And in some environments, you know, something as simple as, you know, what used to be, you know, using Google 40, 50 times a day, you know, hearing more and more stories of it's like, nope, first stop is ChatGPT, or, you know, some other like large language model to do the search or deep research or whichever tool. And I think the question of, you know, if everything that we do on a screen could potentially be automated, what does that mean in terms of our day-to-day lives? And I think that is a broader question, you know, in the nonprofit context, to ask like, what is the value of the existence of the organization, and you know, what do we value? And I think, you know, one highlight that has come up is, you know, what is the value of human relationships, and you know, what role does AI play in that, in terms of, you know, augmenting, you know, our capacity, you know, to make human relationships. But I think it's a very fine line too, where, you know, the handover into, it's like, okay, well, are we going to automate the relationship itself? And the example that I like to use is, you know, I can automate a whole bunch of things in my life, but we have to draw the line somewhere. And I think that is a uniquely human thing that we can't ask AI to draw lines for us. It'll just be like, okay, maximize economic value and, you know, squeeze every, you know, living breath out of us. Is that, you know, I wouldn't automate, you know, reading to my child. Like that's a hard no for me. It's like, you know, sure, I could outsource it to, you know, some home bot to, you know, read my child the story tonight. But where else do we draw those lines? And I think there are implications in terms of training for work, like not just like day-to-day work, but also education as a whole. But I'll speak to the work example, is that the traditional model has been like, you know, you come in an organization, like, you know, you learn the ropes of how to do the thing, grind it out, figure out how to automate some of the things along the way, and keep it going. Is that an entire layer of that may be more difficult to gain that experience, especially if the tasks that typically you would grind it out for a little bit can be abstracted into like an AI automation or an agent. How are people going to learn and progress in their careers in a very different way? So I think, you know, rethinking how do we do the training? Like, you know, do we train people in the basics? And, you know, again, make it mandatory, even though AI can do it, because it's important to learn the specific steps. But I think there's, you know, some parts are analogous in terms of, you know, a calculator, like, you know, you learn to do the math and you use the calculator, and, you know, the calculator, you know, you do most of the time, and very rarely will you have to do it manually, but it's still helpful to know the basic principles behind it. So I think things like that around how organizations handle their employee well-being and their mental health, where, you know, as we can do more, what are we going to do with the time that's supposedly freed up? Are we just going to fill it up with like demand more outputs out of it? Are we attending to, you know, you know, making sure that people are still exercising their mental muscle? You know, there has been research that's indicated that, you know, using AI a great deal can result in a bit of atrophying in some of the basic skills. And so, you know, will we have to look at using our mental faculties as akin to working out. Like, we do it, to stay healthy and everything, but like, yeah, do we have to think about mental workouts where it's like, okay, 1 day a week, we're not using AI, so that we can, ensure that we still know how to do things. So in terms of the preparation, I think what will it look like 1 year from now, 3 years from now, 5 years from now, I think it's being clear about what it is that we value, like what do we hold sacred, and kind of exploring some of those thoughts around, what are we willing to automate in our lives and what are we not? Like, I'm not, right now, I'm not keen on automating, the entire act of cooking. Like, there are some things that are still enjoyable, people coming together over food and, that kind of stuff. It's different for different people though. And so, yeah, that's where I'll leave it there.
Byron, let me ask you, then I'll turn it open to the room and to online, to the digital world. So you said we haven't thought very much about it. I mean, as a political scientist, I'm watching right now events unfold that are really about, at least partially, correcting a worker dislocation that happened 40 years ago, right? And where government policy is focused on that. I mean, is when you say we haven't thought about it enough, is it that government regulation is not sufficient? I mean, where does it have to land for us to get up to speed on the ethics of what in many respects sound like employment dislocations, but not only, many other things? I mean, how do we get up to speed on that?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I'm paying fairly close attention to the current federal election campaign, and I don't think I've heard anybody talking about UBI, Universal Basic Income. Maybe I missed that. I don't know. I don't think I missed it. Right. To me, this should at least be part of public discussion at this point. If it's true that we're facing fairly significant, a non-trivial degree of structural unemployment due to AI on the horizon, right? i.e., within the next 5 to 10 years, then that's at a concrete policy level, that strikes me as something we should be talking about right now, because it's not simple, right? And you can see how there would be all kinds of fracture in society and ideological lines, even trying to put a proposal like that forward, right? But there are probably good reasons to think about doing it right now. So that would be one, to me, that would be, if we were having a serious and adult conversation about UBI, that would be good evidence that we are taking some of the threats on the unemployment issue seriously, at least, right? So yeah, I mean, there are others that I don't think we're having a conversation at all about.
Like what?
Well, I mean, I think so take the war in Ukraine and Russia, right? Like, there are aerial drone companies that are testing out in that conflict autonomous weapons, autonomous drones. There's so far that technology is restricted to just aerial drones, because navigation issues for AI are much easier in the air than they are on land for obvious reasons. And they're not being used widely, autonomous weapons there, right? But they are being tested for possible future use. And so the thing about autonomous weapons, right, is that you can think of a loop between sort of the navigation to a target, finding the target and locking in on it and engaging it and destroying it, right? Ideally destroying it. That's a loop. And the definition of an autonomous weapon is that that's a closed loop, right? The machine is doing all of that. And so that's the kind of weaponry that's being tested out there. There are all kinds of reasons for being very worried about that, right? Like, given the fact that it could become very, very cheap to make these things, does that lead to a massive proliferation issue? And they'll become cheap enough that they can get into the hands not just of smaller states, but also of non-state actors. Just about anybody will be able to make these things, right? So I think that's a deep worry, but it also, at a more sort of existential level, the thing about war is that, the journalist Chris Hedges a while ago wrote a book called "War is a Force That Gives Life Meaning," which was not a celebration of war, right? He's an anti-war activist. Hedges is, but he was just pointing to the fact that, historically speaking, human beings have derived a great deal of their understanding of what they're doing in the world by the fact that we sometimes kill each other in a war theater, right? And so what happens to all of that? Like the whole tradition of just war theory in philosophy and religion, for example, is about defining the circumstances under which it is morally permissible to do that, to kill other people. And it all involves something like recognizing that you're killing a person and taking responsibility for doing that and understanding the gravity of what you're doing and all that. If you've got the kind of closed loop I'm talking about, those machines are by definition incapable of any of that, right? And so there's a good chance that they will dehumanize war even more than it currently is if they go into widespread use. And I do see that kind of as a quite possible trajectory in the near future, given what's happening in Ukraine. That is the front line for autonomous weaponry right now, development.
Okay, I feel like I've been in a very privileged position here to have this conversation with the three of you and learn so much, but we'd love to open it up. I know there's a microphone around, just so I see a couple of questions on Zoom, and I'll go to them, but are there any questions in the room? Deborah, well, we've got a couple of questions in the room, and then I'll go to the couple questions on Zoom. Thanks, Eric.
Thank you so much. So I'm gonna come off, so that's so frightening what you just said about warfare, but I'm gonna talk a little bit about our institution. And it seems to me that post-secondary institutions are uniquely underprepared and unable to deal with the values piece that you described before, that you've all addressed, right? And Byron, you said, we got to have those discussions up front. What I see is two things having happened, or two realities colliding. One is, as you said, the speed at which these technologies are pushed out. And students are all using them. They're out there. This idea we can't stop it. Combined with academic autonomy on the part of faculty to do what they want in their courses, which means the institution can't impose an approach. It's hard to have hard to have a good discussion on it. I think we have had some good discussions, but these are difficult discussions. As a result, we have faculty at Laurier and in every post-secondary institution the world over that their orientation towards Gen AI in their courses, course conduct, course design, spans the entire spectrum from absolute prohibition to embedding AI tools in every aspect of their course, from the course artifacts all the way through to assessments, et cetera, et cetera. So this is what we're left with. Students are really whiplashed by this. And, we hear lots of students saying, like, I don't know, what am I doing? In this course, I'm allowed to do this. In that course, I'm allowed. And then we try to have discussions about academic integrity, right? And there's some baseline things that we can get across, right? So, of course, you can't pass off AI, completed work as your own. That's the basic. But we're in a little bit of a no person's land on this, and we can't walk back from where we are now. And I guess I would be really interested to know, where does a post-secondary education or how does a post-secondary education institution have a discussion on this, given where we already are? Like, we're already mired in confusion.
Anyone want to start us off on? But a super important one.
Thanks, Byron. That's a very good question, Deborah. It's a tough one, right? No. Well, it's a big question, right? It's one that I think a lot of people are obviously asking, and there are no good answers for it, because I think, like Byron was saying a few minutes ago, I mean, even if you assume that the rate of progress we're talking about potentially here, and we're making a lot of assumptions built into this, but assuming that it's 100 years and 10 years, universities don't move very quickly, and for all the reasons you kind of mentioned. So how do you evolve? Well, I think about it as an historian. I think increasingly, if we don't evolve, we are going to be, teaching people to go fix cars by teaching them to be blacksmiths at the same time, right? Because it's not really like that. The automobile revolution plays out over decades. And we're talking about compressing that into probably a couple of years, right? Or a few years. It's clear we have to do something, but you're right. What do you do about it? I think it's moving beyond this kind of thing that Gen AI is this new kind of thing that we all have to be kind of aware of and like, what is it? To actually accepting that, this is part of the world and that we have to kind of figure out how to manage it. And again, as I just find myself saying that, I don't really mean manage it, because this implies it's something that you need to kind of put distance between yourself and the technology. You've got to, mediate it in some way. And that's important undoubtedly, but like leaving that part of the question or the conversation aside for a second, I think the place where we're lagging right now is figuring out, what value is a university education in a world where a lot of the stuff we teach can be automated. And I think that, to be honest, is the real kind of blockage that we face, is how do you get beyond that question? That if what we teach is critical thinking skills, what we teach is, literally parse information, extract it, and repurpose it and do something with it, and you can get AI to do that, well, what do we do? And I think there are answers you can come up with to that very easily, but it involves us confronting the fact that that may well be what the world of work looks like, and it may be kind of more what Jason's talking about, in which education facilitates things rather than being kind of what it is now. So it's not a good answer to your question, because there isn't one, right? And nobody's really wrestling with this in the kind of the way that we need to be wrestling with it. And that forces us to get to the point of seeing AI as being something that is already here, that we are contending with, rather than discussing it in the theoretical, which is kind of what I often see people doing, right? How do we manage plagiarism? Well, okay, in the real world, this probably isn't going to be plagiarism in a few years. We have to think about what this looks like, right? So yeah, that's my answer.
Jason or Byron, do you want to weigh in on Deborah's question?
I think what comes to mind for me is like, I get the sense that like there has been a constant pendulum swing of the expectations for what university is expected to do on the spectrum of like, a university is for, training, it's for work to, creating well-rounded individuals that are, informed and critical, and everything in between. And I think about like the vision of what um, what is a graduate of the university supposed to embody, and what is that clear to everyone across the board? And again, it's kind of, for me, it goes back to the values piece, and I don't, it's certainly not like a simple answer to any of it. It's more of an exploration. If there's not a clear vision of what that is across the board, then the expectation that there's going to be a unified response across the board is also going to be fragmented. And so, but I do wonder about, what the role of that very clear vision and values, and like matched up against like what do we hold dear at the university, as to like, what does a graduate look like? What does the experience look like? And, to the degree that, AI is being integrated into classes or being banned, I think the larger question is like, is someone who is, taking a course, getting the experience that is needed to build a better individual, to, advance, the goal of, their education overall. But to Mark's point around like the education itself and plagiarism, I mean, I'm hearing from some folks where it's like, hey, do we need to revert back to oral examinations and to kind of get a better understanding? And like, I mean, I've taken courses in the past where it was, 50% midterm, 50% final. I kind of have like dump everything into a thing. And, it definitely has its pros and cons, but, it would result in a very large reframing about, well, if we have to budget, time for doing oral examinations for thousands of students, how does that rejig everything?
Any thoughts on this?
Yeah, just briefly, like, it's a really good question, right? And a complicated one. I think that LLMs are a complete disaster for pedagogy, right? But I'm open to the suggestion that this is in large part a kind of bias of of my being in a particular present where we're undergoing this massive transition, right? So a good way to think about technology very generally, and especially AI, is that it can help with some cognitive offloading, right? So you think about the example of simple example of a calculator that was brought up a little earlier, right? Like we offloaded the function of doing simple arithmetic to these relatively simple machines, and as a result of that, most of us lost the ability to do simple arithmetic, right? And the same goes for spell check, right? Like I think but that's cognitive offloading is not per se a bad thing. Like you need to do a cost benefit analysis. Like I think on the whole, the fact that we have calculators to do simple arithmetic for us is a good thing, because it frees us up cognitively speaking to do other things, right? So that's the way in general I think to think about large language models and ChatGPT and things like that in particular, right? That's a form of cognitive offloading. So the question we have to ask is, we go to apply the cost benefit analysis, right? And from my perspective, I see more cost than benefits to that at the moment, right? Like I think something of immense value, namely the ability to, since we can't actually trust students, unfortunately, to write on their own anymore, right? So so we don't have them in our courses. Not all students. I mean, a critical mass of enough students that we can't make assignments like that anymore. That's effectively where we're at, right? So something of immense value is being lost there when we're not teaching our students how to write, because teaching writing skills is a way to teach thinking skills. I mean, I believe that at a very, very deep level. And so the question is, what's replacing it, right? Like, I think that could be a good thing, but what is it? Well, it's like there's an ability to craft queries and get answers from these systems that is being developed right now, and maybe that can be honed into a very valuable kind of cognitive asset, right? Just you come out of a degree with the ability to ask really good questions, right? As opposed to the ability to craft good arguments. I do think those are two different skills. And only time will tell which way the cost benefit analysis works out in that case. I'm pessimistic, but I might be wrong.
Let me offer a question from Zoom, and then I see the gentleman in the second row there. I'm going to read this because it's using language, the vocabulary that I don't possess. Does the panel see agentic AI evolving as something along the lines of an identity digital twin for individuals, responding to these issues mentioned today, for example, literacy training, acting, an identity digital twin? Is that something you see in the future with agentic AI? I mean, it might be related to a second question here, which is, I'm worried that we're going to be living in a world like the Terminator movies. I mean, which is this science fiction? Is this science fiction? What?
I could start.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I don't know exactly what the person means by digital twin, but there's a danger of a kind of narcissism seeping into the entities that we create, right? So, like, take sort of love or relationship assistance, right? Where you're like replica.com, for example, right? So replica.com allows you to you just go look to their website, right? They say you can create your digital soulmate, right? And I think they also use the language like someone who is always on your side. And so, which is a very telling phrase, right? Somebody who's always on your side. And so this company is their stock is like skyrocketed, right? Replica.com. And there's reports of like millions of people falling in love with their chatbots. And like the CEO of the company has been invited to weddings between users and their chatbots, right? So you got to ask, like, what's going on there, right? And I'm especially interested in that phrase, somebody who's always on your side. So it may be that you get all of these millions and millions of people using this particular service because they can create this purely affirmative other, right? That never tells them that they're wrong. There's no friction, there's no negativity, there's none of that real world shit that we all have to deal with other people, right? And to what extent does that completely distort our understanding of interpersonal relationships insofar as we become highly like emotionally attached to these entities, right? You don't have to say anything about the extent to which they are genuine agents. I think they're probably not yet, although they could be. I'm open to that suggestion, as I said earlier, right? But the issue for me now is the way in which that kind of interaction with AI might be distorting and corrupting an individual's ability to function properly in the real world, and it's a form of narcissism, right?
So interesting. Okay. Gentleman in the second row, get you the microphone.
Oh, thanks. Thanks so much. My name is Alex Levant. I teach in the Department of Communication Studies here. It's nice to see you, Mark. I haven't talked to you in a while. I want to follow up on the previous question earlier about the student experience. I taught a course last fall, fourth-year seminar called Critical AI Studies, where we took up some of these questions. Really, really interesting. One of the things that really struck me that the students share with me is that there's a real gap between their experience in the university, where they're largely told not to use these technologies, and their experience in the workplace, which is very real. They're all working right now, where they're being told to figure out how to use these technologies. Very different worlds. And so we tried to address some of these issues in the class. We also tried to, or I guess I also tried to look at the piece in terms of academic integrity and try to impress upon the students how these technologies could be used in other ways. That using these things to write our essays is kind of like using a calculator to write messages like we used to do in the old days. Not the best use of this technology. Shunning it, of course, is not the right approach, but how to best use it. And one of the things we tried to do was I got a little bit of research money, and I brought in a local AI system into the class on a weekly basis. I would haul this computer in, and to give them a chance to use a machine like this, which is very different from using ChatGPT. They all use ChatGPT, but that's just like Googling. It doesn't feel any different on that end. When you're using a local AI system, and what I did was I actually attached a little robot head to it and gave it a memory so they could talk to it. And they did that. And when I told them this thing is not online, it's not on the internet, it's not Googling its answers, it doesn't have a database. You're literally talking to this head, and there's a box under it that's generating this information. Most of them didn't believe me. Jaws dropped. It was a real moment of contradiction that they were faced with, something they don't experience when they use generative AI, typically by using ChatGPT and all those systems. Very, very different. And that created a certain pause. And then we started to explore other directions for this technology. There's so much more here, right? I guess the question I wanted to pose to the panelists and others in the room, the use of local AI systems, local open source AI systems is an alternative to ChatGPT and all of these proprietary systems, particularly in relation to the question of privacy and surveillance in the university. There is so much concern about that. There's so much litigation around that. There is so many famous cases these days around that. Is this a viable? I just want to get your opinions as a viable alternative. I know this is something that that's being discussed in other places on an institutional level. I haven't heard about this at Laurier at all. Very interested in this myself in my own research. I'm very curious to see what other people think.
Any thoughts on that, the local AI system? Go ahead, Jason.
I would
Should I just quickly explain? Sorry, let me just
Sort of
quickly
explain
explain.
what
We're all
local-
trapped in these AI Twitter worlds as well. So local AI. Typically, when we use these AI services, all our data goes from our computer to a data center in the US or somewhere else. What is done with that data? We have absolutely no idea. When you have a local AI system, like what I had in the classroom, none of the data left the box. It was all in the box. Privacy law in Canada prohibits the use of data for purposes that are different from what they're intended to. So for training, AI systems, all those kind of things. That's completely illegal. But it's very difficult to enforce. Very, very difficult to enforce. So as soon as the data leaves, it's very difficult to enforce. But when you have a locally running system, it's impossible for that data to leave. It's literally impossible. So you can either do it on a computer like I had in the classroom, or you can do it on a more established level on an institutional basis. So the university could have a system and it would never leave the university as opposed to just that box, right? So
Okay.
they're different approaches. They tried something like that at University of Michigan. This has also been discussed by Kelvin, what's it? Getting the name wrong, McKelvey, the Canada Research Chair for AI at McGill, to do like a CAN GPT. I've just been researching on this, but
Okay.
I haven't heard of anything at Laurier, and I'm just curious about this to
Yeah,
see what others think.
It seems like it addresses a privacy issue. among
Yeah,
others.
exactly.
Yeah, I certainly think that the like hosting a local model is within the realm of the possible, and veering onto the viable. It's what often comes to mind is unfortunately convenience often is prioritized, and I think we're dealing with some of the interplays between like um, policies and market-based kind of dynamics around privacy, where in some regards, like privacy uh, can be a premium, and to the degree that if legislation requires certain things, then it becomes just a baseline of what is possible with regards to some of the open models. I think at its current state, the good local models are constrained by the cost of hardware, where running like a decent model demands a machine that is thousands of dollars at the very least. Like you can run the smaller models, but it's gonna be a lot slower. It's gonna be a lot more basic. It's gonna be like a couple generations old. Um, but I my hope is that depending on where the technology goes, and I think this is the fork in the road in terms of what we can demand of the future and what we purchase, is that if the progression of processing power within our phones, our computers, continues to increase on an exponential scale, that there may be a future in which perhaps even an earbud, that the entire model is local there. But I think one of the tensions is that entire business models are being built around AI and the networking models around it, and that all the information that's feeding into it is also like strengthening the network and like learning more and more. And so I think about some of the not quite like network effects, but somewhat in terms of the what people are willing to trade off. I mean, we have many of the models right now are available for free, and the trade-off is like, well, we'll take all your information to train the models, and that is you know uh, been accepted either explicitly, or perhaps folks may not be as aware of just how much information they may be giving to the models to be trained, but that's the current market model that makes it worthwhile for a business to exist around it. I think there is a future for local models, but in its current state, unless there is wider either systemic support or institutional support for these kinds of things, I think about privacy enhancing messaging systems like and certain like apps like Signal, that if any of you have been the lone Signal user in a group of friends and trying to, it's like, oh, but we all use like all the other platforms, and it's like, oh, but this is the privacy enhancing one. And uh, I think adoption of open source as well. If a viable model can be built around it to keep it like sustained, and it's always I find the sustainability model around it, where the open source models are out there, but that in itself is part of the broader business plan for some of the companies that are releasing those open source models.
Mark, you want to weigh in?
Yeah, no, I think it's a good question, Alex, and I think it raises some interesting ways of thinking about this, right? I think what a lot of people don't realize is the disparity in capabilities of models from, and I mean, I know you do, but there's a lot of people who don't realize that, you know, this model can do X and it can't do Y, and this one can do X and Y and Z, right? And so that's where you get into the difference between open source and closed models. So for me, for example, I spent a lot of time working on getting models to transcribe, you know, 18th century handwriting as an example. And if you use open source models, they can't really do it with any level of accuracy. If you use, you know, the new Gemini 2.5 Pro, it's about as good as a human is, right? And so that's the trade-off there. Now, the other thing that's important is that if you're running a model locally, you're only, just unless you've got millions of dollars worth of hardware, you're only interacting with it kind of on one stream or one thread, right? And the difference is if you're using something like Gemini or ChatGPT or GPT 4.0 or Claude, you can, you know, send 1,000 pages simultaneously, have them all transcribed in 20 seconds, and have them all come back. And that's where with AI, it's important to understand that a lot of the transformative nature of what's going to happen is going to be in the scale, not of the models themselves, but in the actual, the scaling up of that capacity so that you can have, you know, 10,000 models or versions of that same model doing 10,000 tasks for you simultaneously in parallel. And that's where the revolutionary speed comes in. And you can do that locally potentially, but then the problem becomes, you know, that's where OpenAI needs to raise tens of billions of dollars in capital so they can go and build these giant data centers so they can run those models. So I think that would be, I think local models are important, but at the same time, I think at least for the foreseeable future, as Jason's saying, they're going to be a ways behind, right, in that sense.
There's let me do a quick question from Zoom and then go to the gentleman in the front row. And I think you alluded to this earlier, Mark, asking about the environmental impact of AI. What's the environmental impact? You mentioned a little bit earlier that there's a lot of energy being used. I mean, are there other environmental impacts? Can you speak to that?
A little bit. I mean, I'm not, you know, we're actually in a paper that our team recently published. We had to kind of address this a little bit, and there's a lot of really contradictory and confusing information that's out there. There's a good paper that came out in Nature a few months ago, which basically says it's really hard to actually figure out what's happening, right, with environmental impacts. One of the ways I look at this, right, is that there's a huge amount of energy that's consumed to run these models, right? And to train them especially, but to run inference, meaning that's the thing that happens when the model's writing text back to you. There's an awful lot of, you know, energy that's also used just in cloud computing in general. And I think this goes back to Alex's question as well, which is that we tend to look at AI and everything gets focused through that lens. And the reality is that, you know, people are very concerned about privacy around their documents and stuff with AI. And that makes total sense, except they might not realize that when you store your documents on a Google or on a Google Drive or on, you know, your OneDrive, that's also, you know, on the cloud. And that legally, there's probably no difference. I'm going to make a very important distinction here in a second between storing something on a OneDrive and sending it not to ChatGPT, but sending it over a secure network like Azure, Microsoft Azure, to a model that's FIPA compliant. So it's basically the same kind of thing. And that those two things are very synonymous. And it's kind of true as well with the environmental impacts, that if you're using cloud computing in general, there's environmental impacts to Google searches and all those things. The way in which to actually quantify that is very difficult because we don't know often that we don't have the data on the models themselves to know what, you know, how much energy they actually are consuming. There's a lot of estimates out there. A lot of that's based on older things. It's safe to say it consumes a lot of resources. It's also safe to say, you know, that a lot of things you do on the internet and don't think about because they don't have AI in front of them do the same thing, right?
Yeah. Byron, did you want to weigh in on that? You've thought a lot about environmental issues, specifically climate change. Is there a link between your work on climate change and technology?
Yeah, not in my own work particularly. I haven't looked explicitly into the connection. I mean, I haven't written about the connection. Let me put it that way. But I don't think that there's any doubt both that the climate impact of these developments is huge and that most of the companies, the big companies engaging it, are not revealing the amount of energy that they're actually using. And so I have read some estimates according to which, for example, the amount of energy required to train these models, all of them, is equivalent to the entire transportation industry globally, right? Which is a huge number. And so, of course, then you got to ask, well, where's the energy currently coming from? Well, like, when you're talking about draws on energy that large, we're still in fossil fuels, right? I mean, coal is abundant, and so we're burning a lot of coal to run these models, globally speaking, right? Most people, I think, realize that the days of fossil fuels are numbered. They're not numbered enough from my point of view, but they're numbered, so that perhaps by mid-century we will be at something like net zero. And I think that what you're seeing, at least in the States, is in the light of that fact, or that probability, is a concerted push to expand the nuclear footprint as really the only way to the only viable way to power these programs. And so it's not an accident that all the tech firms are in there with Trump, right? I think that Trump is probably going to massively deregulate there, right, in terms of all the red tape that's required to get nuclear facilities up and running, so that you can do so, in 5 to 10 years instead of 30 or 40 years. And the proliferation of nuclear power plants comes with problems of its own, right? Not carbon pollution necessarily, but its own kinds of problems. So I think that's where things are at right now. The energy footprint is gigantic. It's currently supplied mostly by fossil fuels, but it's moving into nuclear very quickly.
Thank you for that. You had a question.
Yeah, so my question was going to also be about the environmental impact, so I guess I'll just get a little more specific with my line of questioning. So we've mentioned like hundreds of millions of dollars in like data centers and servers and all this like storage essentially. But one thing that we see with a lot of technologies is things getting smaller over time and old systems being discarded. So I think that's another avenue to explore as well, is the e-waste, right? Because especially if we're going to be, as I forget the name, but the guy that predicted a century in 10 years, we're going to be discarding a lot of these servers as they become obsolete, as things get smaller and smaller. So what about that? What about that angle? How do we see this going, basically?
Interesting question.
Well, nowhere good. I do think that's a big question. It's good that I think you put it in terms of that sort of compression theory that I was talking about a little bit earlier. There is and will increasingly be a whole lot of e-waste, where it goes is anybody's guess. I don't know, right? Like the so-called first world will try and keep as much of it as possible out of sight, therefore out of mind. Like we've always done, we will probably pollute the rest of the world with very little compunction. I don't know that I have any more to say about that than that. Unless we can find some way of like shipping it up to asteroids or something like that and leaving it there, right? Space garbage. Mm-hmm.
Got a couple more. Oh, okay, go ahead. I've got a couple more. You go ahead, and I'm going to check what I've got here on Zoom.
Okay. Hi, I'm Jen Bichard. I'm a fourth year major here in the Faculty of Arts. I'm also an instructional assistant for a first year media history class. And something we talk a lot about in that class is that when a new technology is diffused through society, it's not taken up equally by all people. It's taken up differently by different groups. And not everybody has equal access to it. And specifically, you've all talked a lot about labor during the panel, but certain types of labor, mainly academic, intellectual labor. And I kind of have a harder time picturing how AI could sort of interact with domestic labor, care work, things predominantly done by women, people who don't have university degrees, etc. And I guess my question is, for any and all of you, do you see any concern that sort of the unequal access to AI will exacerbate sort of existing inequalities between different types of work? And if so, if there are any sort of solutions or things we can do to kind of, I don't know, mitigate that?
I think one of the things that comes to mind is in the past, I was in a role where they there would be opportunities that would be available that would be posted online, and that if there were if you went on a basis of like, oh, first person to respond gets the thing, then everyone with a cell phone, with access to the internet gets an immediate kind of opportunity. And what we ended up looking at was, how can we ensure that our internal policy is that an opportunity is posted for X amount of time, allowing folks with varying access to the internet to have an opportunity to put their name in, and then do a random drawing to try and make it a bit more equitable there. With regards to AI usage, to the degree that yes, so, some models are available online and free, is that embedding AI in everything is like, in my opinion, like I generally advise folks to, like, if it's useful for you, like certainly explore and use it. But everyone, to the degree that you can, like, explore if it is a fit, for their particular use case. But I think this does speak to broader challenges around, like, not just AI, but like technology accessibility, which then also relates to things around ensuring that people have access to training, to education, to basic funds to meet their needs. So I think the question around like AI and access is also closely tied into broader policy around broadband access, and what providers are required to do, and as an on-ramp to accessing some of those broader services.
I'm aware that we're getting close to the end of time. I see two more questions that I'd love to get to on Zoom. Maybe I'll share them both, and depending on which one speaks to you, you can come in on it. The first one, the internet has evolved from an open source or institutional technology into something used wholly for profit extraction. Gen AI has been developed by private technology companies for this purpose from the start. Do you think there's any way to change course towards something more public? Or are we kind of in that public, private paywall universe with AI? That's one. The other one, and this might be for you, Jason, what should a nonprofit serving homeless youth consider when exploring the uses of AI in optimizing its services for youth? Are there good starting points that you can think about? Want to jump in there, Byron?
I'm sure. Like, I can say something about the first question, and maybe leave the second one for Jason or Mark. For sure, impossible, right? We can redraw the public-private line anywhere we like in theory, right? So it's telling, for example, that like when you listen to some of the CEOs of the big AI research labs, research houses, or at least this is the way they used to talk, right? Like 5 or 6 years ago. I haven't heard it for a while, but sometimes they'll say when the topic of the development of AGI comes up, they'll say things like, "This should be taken out of our hands. It's too big. It's too important. Its potential impacts mean that it should be in the hands of some entity other than a private corporation that can genuinely make decisions about it on the basis of some conception of the public good. And I was like, wow, a CEO of a company said that, like that's pretty amazing, right? Coming from them. Now, I don't think there's much unanimity among them on that view. And I don't know who it was. I think maybe it was Sam Altman who said that, actually. So if there could be pressure to get these research labs to move in that direction, whereby if they've crossed certain thresholds, and what those exactly are, I'm not sure, right? But if they've crossed certain thresholds in the development of artificial general intelligence or artificial superintelligence, then at that fact, the enterprise gets handed over to government, and then that comes with its own problems, of course, right? You got to make a lot of assumptions about the values and prerogatives of the governments that happen to be in power whenever that happens, which may not be a good thing. But anyway, but anyway, I guess the general point is just that yeah, this is in principle possible, and it's good to see that at least some people in the corporate world are on board with the general principle.
Thank you. Do either of you want to weigh in on that question or the second question, or the second question?
I'll weigh on just kind of what Byron was talking about there. I think I don't know, I always like to think that there are also other sides to this too, right? Which I think a lot of people kind of focus on the negative consequences that are often obvious with AI, or the potential ones. But I think there's a democratizing power to this that people kind of miss out on as well, which is that, there's a cost using AI financially, but it's often fractions of a penny, right? And so there's an ability for people using some of the tools that are out there now to do things that would have required whole groups of people in the past, or whole teams of people. And that's got a labor element to it and a workforce element, but there's an empowering element to that too, right? Which is that you can now, kind of sitting in your basement, start your own company, or you can start your own kind of research project that you wouldn't be able to feasibly do before. I think about graduate students, that the amount of work, because I don't see things like what we do in history disappearing. What I see happening is a shift in how we do some of these things. And so I think about graduate students, some of whom are here, being able to just do things faster. They don't have to pay tuition for as long a period of time, right? They're able to do things that they wouldn't have been able to do in the past without spending enormous sums of money, right? And that's useful. So I think is, an example of the way the coin has both two different sides to it. In transcription, as just one historical example from my own work, if you transcribe 1,000 pages and that costs you $10, right? There's a labor element to that, because, maybe you would have paid an RA to do that before. The reality is probably we're hiring an RA to do something with all of that, and we may actually end up hiring more people to do that. There's an argument for that as well. But on the other side of that, right, the benefit you derive from something that costs, 1/10 of 1 cent per page is pretty profound. And that's just in one little area. In coding, as an example, building software, the ability to, not just program 10,000 lines of code, but then to iterate on that over weeks to produce an app, and to actually, there's a really empowering part of this. It makes knowledge available to people who wouldn't have otherwise had access to that knowledge. We don't think about some of those sides of this as often. So I guess I would encourage people, as we're kind of weighing the cost of this, which I think we do talk a lot about. There's also that side too of there's this empowering side to it, and this is a weird technology. We aren't used to something that costs next to nothing in terms of spending money to get access to it, while at the same time, 10xing productivity and doing things 10 times faster. That's a very strange technology we don't have any parallels for. And getting our heads around that it can be all three simultaneously. There are drawbacks. We have to consider both sides, I think.
Jason?
I think to the first question, what comes to mind is that a significant amount of advanced research goes into building these large language models, and it's not done solely within the corporate environment, and that there's a lot of work that's been done in universities, and I think that definitely underscores the importance of recognizing that broader ecosystem, that the interplays between like, the funding of education, but also, how does that, how is that understood in the broader framework in terms of like overall value creation, and that, yes, it's, you know, uh, a profit-driven venture as well, but what are the obligations or responsibilities to also keep that ecosystem thriving and going on an ongoing basis. To the second question around usage of AI, I'm very reluctant to put out like general like you use it in this very specific way, and I think that is because it can be very individual, and I think that a better place to start with regards to technology in general is to get a good understanding of what the day-to-day challenges and problems of people are, and if AI fits, then by all means, like use AI for that. But if someone needs to fry an egg, like I'm not going to say like, okay, use a shovel. Like you can use a shovel to fry an egg, but you probably don't want to. It's not the best tool for the job. So I think overall, like recognizing AI is one of the things that can be used to help people. But I think that overall, whether AI or otherwise, like the world would be a better place with technology if we took a bit more time to kind of understand what the core challenges are. And again, going back to the values question, or like what's the value framework that we're looking at this for? Like, are we trying to save time? Are we trying to make your life better? Are we just trying to get from A to B? So that's my general response to that.
Great, thank you. Well, unfortunately, we're out of time. I want to thank LCSC for hosting us today, Matt, Eric, Kevin, Emily, for all your work and helping us, all of you for coming today. And I really want to thank the three of you. I know I learned a ton. And it's so nice to be reminded that for these major issues of the day, we don't have to go very far. We've got this incredible expertise in our own faculty, our own alumni, and it's really nice to be reminded of that. So thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us today.